Let's look at the latest. So overnight, Israel's military told the people living in Northern Gaza, that's more than 1 million people, to relocate south. And as we spoke to our correspondent, that ground invasion, that ground incursion is expected any time. The tanks are there, but obviously the government not giving exact details. After Saturday's devastating attack by Hamas, Israel's retaliation has been devastating as well for many in the small enclave. According to Reuters, more than 2,800 people have died over the last week or so. And as the fighting shows no sign of abating but is escalating instead, world leaders are responding in different ways. Let's bring in an analyst now. We're joined by Senior Research Fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues, Thembisa Fakude. Thembisa, great to chat to you as always. I want to start with world leaders because it's being reported that G20 leaders meeting in Morocco, in Marrakech, on the sidelines of the IMF and World Bank meeting, have issued a communique that makes no mention. It's quite incredible. No mention of the conflict, which I guess would suggest that the world is divided, so you can't get a unified stance right now.
Yeah, there's no unified stance, but what you see at the moment is the unraveling of human highest point of cruelty, to be given a 24-hour notice to vacate for 1 million people is basically an excuse of a genocide. So what we are seeing in real time on our television screens is genocide in progress. And you have the G20 nations and other Arab countries that have normalized relations with Israel and continue to normalize relations with Israel, watching this genocide taking place. It's a sad day in history. It's going to be an indictment for all of us who are watching this genocide at the moment unfolding. And unfortunately, now one did not expect anything from G20. It's expected that they were going to try and be mute in this regard. United Nations, same story. But what is more disappointing, of course, is that the Arab countries from whom you expected at least words of condemnation, strong condemnation and action, they're doing nothing. Instead, we hear of some silent diplomacy taking place, at least between the Qataris and the Egyptians, in terms of speaking sense to the brutes in Israel. But other than that, there's nothing really that's happening at the moment that seeks to stop the current war that's unfolding or taking place at the moment in Gaza.
Look, we are expecting to hear from the UN Secretary General, and UN officials have been saying that this mass movement in 24 hours is impossible. So therefore, the mass deaths of civilians would be envisaged. And like you say, some diplomacy. What do you think about South Africa's handling of it? And I'll just read a statement from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. Say it condemns Israel's violation of the Geneva Conventions and the abandonment of international humanitarian law. Just talking about the convention, saying starvation cannot be used in conflict. And we know food has been cut off, water and power. So are we making sense in that regard?
Well, we are making sense, but the best action that one would expect from the sovereign government that has been vocal and sending correct messages is to expel the Israeli ambassador from this country and withdraw its ambassador from Israel. That would be the best thing that South Africa will do. And that, of course, applies to the Arab countries as well, because as I've said, we are observing a genocide unfolding, and there seems to be nothing that the world can do to stop this. Instead, you have the custodian of democracy, in inverted commas, the United States, that has gone on to encourage and support the brutality that's taking place at the moment in Palestine. So it's a sad day in history, and it's going to, as I've said earlier on, have an indictment to all of us who lived during this time that nothing was done, as much as those that lived during 1945, during the Second World War, who observed the massacre of the Jewish people, particularly in Europe. Now we are observing something similar, and in years to come, we'll have to answer to our next generations what we did in terms of trying to stop this atrocity.
Thembisa, does your stance encompass that Israelis are in pain and what happened last weekend was also devastating?
Well, Francis, you and I lived through apartheid, and there were a lot of atrocities that were committed by the liberation movements, including the ANC and the PAC. But we've never seen a collective punishment from the National Party. I lived in Soweto. After all the bombings that killed a number of white people in this country, there was never an instance when an F-16 was sent to indiscriminately bomb us in the township. There was never an instance where the National Party stopped us from accessing water, food, medical supplies. We still had access to all of those essentials. What you see at the moment is collective punishment, where you're shutting down the borders, you're shooting down trucks that will be coming from Egypt, carrying aid into Gaza. We have shut down water access, we have shut down electricity, there's no medical supplies. So this is like, the highest point of human barbarity and cruelty. So we lived in apartheid, and I know that it's easy for many people to use this low-hanging explanation that Israel is an apartheid state. I think it's worse than apartheid. As I've said, we've never had such harshness from the National Party, notwithstanding that many of us who lived in this country supported the former liberation movements, who are now the governing parties. But the National Party never. In fact, they even protected our churches and places of worship. And they continued whenever there was hailstorms or anything of that sort, they will come the day after to come and help us in the township reconstruct. What you see at the moment is a country that is engaged in, collective punishment, killing women and children and those that are born today and, the elderly. So this is the highest form of human cruelty, and there's nothing else that can describe what's currently happening in Israel, where you have a government calling itself democratic, given an instruction that 1.2 million people must vacate their homes in less than 24 hours or else they'll face death. It's very difficult to even give a description of such an injunction from a democratic government.
Thembisa, very quickly, surely there needs to be a humanitarian corridor. I mean, what can the neighboring countries, what can the world do to make that happen? Why is that not happening?
Well, the neighboring countries have tried. Egypt tried to send humanitarian convoy into Gaza, and Benjamin Netanyahu threatened to bomb. In fact, some of the trucks, we are told, were actually attacked trying to cross Rafah, crossing into Gaza. So this is a human being that is hell-bent at, seeing the genocide in Palestine, notwithstanding that he claims that his ancestors and forefathers were also victims of genocide in Europe. Now he's actually doing exactly the same, if not worse, because this time around, this is in real time. We're all watching and observing what the Israelis are doing in Gaza and what they're promising to do in the next 24 hours. And they were all just quiet about it. Instead, you have sideline meetings and, somehow the United Nations Secretary General is going to be speaking. The Arab countries are just quiet. In Afrikaans, they're saying chup still. They're saying no word. And the Palestinians are all by themselves at the moment in this predicament. Again, it's not all Palestinians that committed the crime which was committed last week, but we are seeing a collective punishment led by the so-called the only democratic state in the Middle East.
All right, strong views from Senior Research Fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues, Thembisa Fakude. We take a short break and then we'll continue focusing on the Middle East, bringing you local news as well, the latest from Tshwane. Thank you for being with us.